Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The rope burned through Decker Haines' palms as he pulled the smaller girl from the ravine, her black hair matted with blood and dust. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched his shirt with fingers that trembled like aspen leaves in a storm. Below them, trapped between two fallen boulders, her older sister, maybe 10, screamed in Apache, words Decker didn't understand but felt in his chest like a fist. The canyon walls threw her voice back at them, multiplying her panic into a chorus of fear. Decker's horse, Rust, stamped nervously at the cliff edge, nostrils flaring at the scent of blood. The sun hammered down on the New Mexico badlands, turning the red rocks into an oven, and Decker's shirt was already soaked through. He'd been tracking a stray calf when he heard the screaming, high and desperate, the kind of sound that strips away everything but instinct. Now he was 40 feet down a crumbling cliff face with a terrified child in one arm and no clear way back up. He pressed the younger girl against the rock wall, her chest heaving against his side. "Stay here," he said, knowing she didn't speak English but hoping his tone carried the message. Her eyes locked onto his, dark brown, almost black, swimming with tears but holding something fierce underneath. She nodded once, quick and sharp, and Decker felt a flicker of hope. The older girl had gone quiet, and that scared him more than the screaming. He could see her wedged between the boulders, one leg bent at an angle that made his stomach turn. Her face had gone gray, lips pressed tight against pain, but her eyes tracked his every movement. Smart kid. She was trying to stay conscious, trying to fight the shock that wanted to pull her under. Decker worked his way down, testing each handhold, rocks crumbling under his boots and tumbling into the darkness below. The ravine breathed out cool air that smelled of mineral and old water, a relief against the furnace heat above. When he reached her, she flinched, then forced herself still. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Decker said softly, the way he talked to a spooked horse. "Gonna get you out." Her eyes narrowed, not suspicious, but calculating. She was measuring him, deciding if he was worth trusting. After a heartbeat, she nodded. Her leg was pinned tight, and Decker had to wedge his shoulder against one boulder while pushing the other with his boots, muscles screaming as he fought to create an inch of space. The older girl bit down on her lip hard enough to draw blood, but she didn't make a sound. When her leg came free, Decker saw the break, clean at least, not a compound fracture, and felt a surge of relief mixed with new worry. Getting her up would be hell. He fashioned a splint from his knife and 2 straight branches wedged between the rocks, using strips torn from his shirt to bind it. Her hands helped, quick and sure despite the pain, and he realized she'd done field medicine before. The climb back up took everything he had. He went first with the older girl on his back, her arms locked around his neck, her breath coming in short gasps against his ear. The younger one followed, climbing like she'd been born on cliff faces, never hesitating, never looking down. Twice, Decker's handhold crumbled and he had to catch himself with his other arm, the girl's weight threatening to pull them both backward into the void. His shoulders burned, his fingers bled, and his lungs felt like they were full of hot sand, but he kept moving. When they finally reached the top, he laid the older girl down in the shade of a juniper tree and let himself collapse beside her. The younger girl threw herself onto her sister, both of them crying now, speaking rapid Apache mixed with sobs. Decker closed his eyes and listened to them, his heart still hammering, and wondered what had brought 2 Apache girls out here alone. Where was their family? Their tribe? The sun had moved 3 handspans across the sky. It was past noon, the most dangerous hours in this country. He gave them water from his canteen, watched them drink like they'd been lost for days. The older girl's leg needed a proper splint and rest. Decker made the decision quickly. His ranch was 8 miles east, too far to carry her. But there was an old line shack 2 miles north, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it would have to do. He loaded the older girl onto Rust, the younger one riding behind to steady her sister, and led the horse on foot through the scrubland. The shadows were starting to stretch long by the time they reached the shack. Inside, it was dim and cool, smelling of pack rats and dust, but the roof was solid. Decker settled the girls on a pile of old blankets, gave them the last of his jerky, and promised to return at dawn with supplies. As he rode away in the purple twilight, he looked back once. The younger girl stood in the doorway, watching him go, her silhouette small and still against the dying light. Something in her posture made him shiver. She looked like she was waiting for something. Like she knew something he didn't. Decker urged Rust into a trot and tried to shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to understand. Decker had built his ranch with his own hands 3 years ago, after his father's death left him with nothing but land and debt. The house was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was his, bought with sweat and silence and seasons of breaking horses for other men who paid in coins they counted twice before handing over. He'd chosen this spot in the Cibola Valley because it had water year-round, a spring that bubbled up clear and cold from some deep place in the earth. The grazing was decent, the winter wind broke against the ridgeline instead of scouring his buildings, and most importantly, it was far enough from Santa Rosa that people left him alone. Decker had learned early that solitude was safer than company. People asked questions. They noticed things. They remembered the scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jawline, the one he'd gotten in a knife fight outside a saloon in Tombstone, back when he was young and stupid and thought proving himself mattered. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the older girl's eyes, that fierce determination mixed with pain, and hearing the younger one's quiet sobs. He'd brought them food, water, blankets. In the morning, he'd ride back with proper medical supplies and figure out where they belonged. Someone had to be looking for them. Apache families didn't just lose children in the desert. The territory had been quiet lately, the wars mostly over, the treaties signed in blood and broken promises. Most of the Apache had been moved to reservations, their lands swallowed by ranchers and miners and the railroad that cut through the territory like a scar. But there were still free bands in the mountains, groups who refused to surrender, who survived on cunning and knowledge of country that white men barely understood. Decker respected that. He respected anyone who refused to bend, even when bending would be easier. He rose before dawn, packed his saddlebags with cornmeal, dried beef, clean bandages, and a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. He added his spare blanket, a tin of beans, and after a moment's hesitation, a small wooden carving of a horse his father had made when Decker was a boy. He didn't know why. It just felt right to bring something that wasn't just survival. The ride to the line shack took an hour in the gray pre-dawn light, the desert still cool, the air sharp with sage and creosote. Rust picked his way through the rocky terrain with the confidence of a horse who knew his way home from anywhere. Decker had raised him from a colt, gentled him with patience instead of breaking him with force, and now they moved together like parts of the same creature. As they approached the shack, Decker felt that prickle again, that sense of being watched. He scanned the ridge lines, the shadowed draws, looking for movement. Nothing. Just the eternal stillness of the badlands, where rocks held secrets older than memory. The girls were awake when he arrived, sitting close together against the back wall. The older one had her arm around her sister, protective even in her weakness. They'd moved the blankets to create a nest, arranged his jacket as a pillow, tried to make order from what little they had. That told Decker something important. They came from a good home, had been taught to take care of things, to respect what was given. The younger girl watched him with those enormous eyes, but this time there was something different in them. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition. Like she'd been expecting him. Decker knelt and unwrapped the older girl's leg carefully. The swelling was worse, purple and hot to the touch, but no sign of infection yet. She hissed when he touched it but didn't pull away. He cleaned it with whiskey, her body going rigid, then rewrapped it with proper bandages, creating a better splint with 2 straight pieces of pine he'd brought. Through it all, she didn't cry out. Just watched his hands with an intensity that made him self-conscious. When he was done, he pulled out the food. They ate like wolves, fast and focused, their eyes never leaving the doorway. Between bites, the older girl spoke in Apache, soft words to her sister, her voice carrying notes of comfort and command. The younger one responded in whispers, and Decker caught a word repeated 3 times. Mother. His gut tightened. He pulled out the wooden horse carving and offered it to the younger girl. She took it carefully, turned it over in her small hands, traced the carved mane with one finger. Then she looked up at him and spoke in halting English. "Tomorrow," she said. The single word hung in the dusty air. "Tomorrow what?" Decker asked. But the girl just held his gaze, her face grave beyond her years, and repeated, "Tomorrow." A chill ran down Decker's spine despite the growing heat. He wanted to ask more. What happens tomorrow? Who's coming? How did you learn English? But something stopped him. The older girl had gone still, watching him with eyes that held old knowledge. Outside, a raven called, harsh and lonely. Decker stood, promised to return again, and left them with enough supplies for 2 more days. As he rode away, he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow, everything was going to change. The younger girl's voice echoed in his head, that single word carrying the weight of prophecy. Tomorrow. Decker had killed his first man when he was 16. Not something he was proud of, not something he talked about, but it sat in his memory like a stone, cold, heavy, unchanging. The man had been a ranch hand who'd caught Decker's mother alone in the barn, his intentions written in the way he'd cornered her, in the sound of fabric tearing. Decker had grabbed the shovel leaning against the stall and swung with every ounce of rage a teenage boy could summon. The crack of skull against iron rang in his ears for years afterward. His mother had looked at him, not with gratitude, but with horror, and that hurt worse than the guilt. She died 2 winters later, took fever and never recovered, and Decker wondered sometimes if she just decided not to fight. His father had been a hard man, made harder by whiskey and the slow realization that the West he'd come to conquer was eating him alive instead. He taught Decker to shoot, to track, to survive, but he never taught him how to live with ghosts. The ranch hands in Santa Rosa whispered about Decker when they thought he couldn't hear. Said he had Apache blood, that his grandmother had been taken in a raid and his father's family line was tainted. It was a lie, but Decker never bothered correcting it. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was simpler and sadder. His father had been a Union soldier who'd lost his faith in causes, his mother a Missouri girl who'd followed a dream west and found only dust. Decker was just a man who'd learned early that the world was divided into those who took and those who got taken from, and he'd sworn to himself he'd never be the latter. That's why he'd chosen this isolated valley, why he kept to himself, why he broke horses instead of working for other men. Freedom was the only thing that mattered, even if it meant eating beans and jerky most nights, even if it meant his clothes were patched and his roof leaked in 3 places. At least the ghosts out here were his own. But those 2 Apache girls had woken something in him he'd thought long dead, the need to protect, to stand between the vulnerable and the violence that always seemed to be circling. When he'd heard them screaming in that ravine, he hadn't thought about the risk or the complications. He'd just moved, his body acting on an instinct deeper than choice. Now, riding back to his ranch in the afternoon heat, he wondered if that instinct was going to cost him. The territory was still raw from the Apache Wars, still bleeding from conflicts that had pitted neighbor against neighbor, still haunted by atrocities committed on both sides. White settlers had been killed in raids. Apache families had been massacred in their camps. Trust was a currency no one could afford. If word got out that Decker was harboring Apache children, some folks would call him a traitor. Others would see an opportunity. Apache scalps still brought bounty money in some places, a fact that made Decker's stomach turn. He spent the rest of the day working on his corral fence, replacing posts that had rotted through, trying to burn off the restless energy that crawled under his skin. His hands knew the work. Measure, cut, dig, set, pack, and he let them move while his mind churned. That word the younger girl had spoken, tomorrow, kept circling back. What was coming tomorrow? Her family? A rescue party? Or something else, something he couldn't predict? The sun arced across the sky, brutal and unrelenting, and Decker worked through the worst of it, punishing his body because it was easier than sitting with his thoughts. By the time shadows started stretching long, his shirt was stiff with dried sweat and his hands were bleeding from splinters he hadn't bothered to pull. He washed up at the pump, the cold spring water shocking against his overheated skin, then stood dripping in the yard and looked east toward where the line shack hid in its fold of rock and sage. That night, Decker dreamed of his mother. She was standing in the barn doorway, backlit by sun so bright he couldn't see her face, and she was speaking to him in a language he didn't understand. He tried to move toward her, but his feet were stuck, rooted like fence posts in hard ground. When he finally woke, his blankets were tangled and the stars through his window had wheeled halfway across the sky. The dream clung to him like smoke, that feeling of desperate incomprehension, of knowing something vital was being said but lacking the language to grasp it. He rose and dressed in the darkness, pulled on his boots and his gun belt out of habit more than fear. Outside, the night was crystalline, the air cool and sharp, the desert alive with the small sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. Decker stood in his yard and looked up at the river of stars, the Milky Way spilling across the black like scattered salt, and wondered what the Apache girls were doing right now. Were they sleeping? Waiting? The word tomorrow felt like a drumbeat, steady and inevitable. He'd face it when it came. That's all any man could do, face what came and hope your instincts were good enough to keep you alive. Decker went back inside, but he didn't sleep again. He just sat in the dark, cleaning his rifle, waiting for dawn, listening to the silence that wasn't silent at all if you knew how to listen. Decker was saddling Rust in the gray pre-dawn light when he saw the smoke signal. It rose from the ridge 2 miles north, 3 distinct puffs, precise and deliberate, black against the paling sky. His hands stilled on the saddle cinch. Smoke signals meant communication, coordination. Someone was talking to someone else, and given the location, it was probably about him or the girls or both. He finished tightening the cinch and swung into the saddle, his Winchester already in its scabbard, his Colt loaded and riding easy on his hip. He didn't ride straight for the line shack. Instead, he circled wide, approaching from the west, using the broken terrain for cover, his eyes constantly scanning. The desert looked empty, but Decker knew better. This land could hide an army if that army knew what it was doing, and the Apache knew. Halfway there, he found the marker, a stack of 3 stones placed deliberately on a flat rock where his path crossed an old game trail. Someone wanted him to see it. Decker dismounted and examined the ground. Fresh tracks, unshod horses, at least 4 of them, maybe 5. They'd passed through here within the last few hours, heading toward his line shack, then looping back north. Not an attack pattern. More like a reconnaissance or a message. Decker remounted and pushed Rust to a faster pace, that prickle of warning intensifying to a cold certainty. Something was happening, pieces moving on a board he couldn't fully see, and he was right in the middle of it. When he crested the final rise and could see the line shack below, everything looked normal. Too normal. The door was closed, no smoke from a fire, no movement. Rust snorted and sidestepped, picking up on Decker's tension. He approached slowly, rifle in hand, eyes everywhere at once. 20 yards from the shack, the younger girl stepped out. She didn't look scared. She looked expectant. Behind her, the older girl sat propped against the door frame, her splinted legs stretched out, but she was alert, tracking Decker's approach with those intense eyes. The younger one walked toward him, small and fearless in the growing light, and Decker dismounted to meet her at her level. She reached into a leather pouch at her waist and pulled out something wrapped in soft buckskin. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a piece of turquoise the size of a silver dollar, polished smooth, with veins of black matrix running through it like captured lightning. It was beautiful and clearly valuable, the kind of stone that took generations to find and shape. The girl held it up to him, speaking in Apache, her voice serious and formal. Then she switched to English, the words careful and practiced. "My mother comes. You saved us. This is promise. She brings reward." Decker stared at the turquoise, his mind racing. "I don't need a reward," he said. "I just need to know you're safe. Where is your family? Your camp?" The girl shook her head. "Mother comes today. You wait." She pressed the stone into his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "The promise stone. You trust." Decker wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in her face stopped him. There was a dignity there, a formality that felt ancient, and he realized he was being included in something ceremonial, something with rules he didn't understand but needed to respect. He closed his fingers around the turquoise and nodded. "I'll wait," he said. The girl's face relaxed into something almost like a smile. She turned and walked back to her sister, and they spoke in rapid Apache, the older one nodding, both of them looking relieved. Decker spent the morning at the line shack, checking the older girl's leg. The swelling was down, a good sign, and sharing his food with them. They ate more slowly today, less desperate, and he noticed details he'd missed before. Their clothes were well made, the buckskin soft and decorated with intricate beadwork. Their hair, once he'd helped them wash it with water from his canteen, was thick and glossy. These weren't children from a struggling band. They came from a family with resources, with skill, with status. That made him more nervous, not less. Important people expected things. They had power and the will to use it. The sun climbed higher, heat building like pressure in a closed room, and Decker found himself watching the horizons, waiting for movement. The younger girl sat beside him for a while, the wooden horse he'd given her clutched in one hand, the turquoise returned to her pouch. She pointed at Rust and said, "Strong horse. Like father's horses." Decker glanced at her. "Your father has horses?" She nodded. "Many horses. He chief." The word hung in the air. Decker's stomach dropped. He'd saved the daughters of an Apache chief. The implications crashed over him like a flash flood. The politics, the danger, the weight of expectation. If he'd offended in any way, if his care had been inadequate, if the injury to the older girl worsened, but also if he'd done right, if his actions had shown respect and courage, then maybe, just maybe, he'd earned something rare and valuable. Understanding across a divide that usually only widened with blood. The sun was directly overhead when the riders appeared. They materialized from the north, 5 figures on horseback, moving with the fluid grace of people who lived in the saddle. Decker stood, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, then forcing himself to relax. The girls stood too, the older one bracing herself against the shack wall. The younger one's face split into a huge smile and she shouted something joyful in Apache. The riders approached slowly, deliberately, giving Decker time to see them clearly. 4 warriors, armed but with rifles and scabbards, not hands. And in front, on a gray horse that moved like smoke, a woman. She was perhaps 40, her face strong-boned and beautiful, her eyes the same shape as her daughter's. She wore traditional dress, elaborately decorated, and carried herself with an authority that needed no announcement. This was a woman who led, who decided, who was obeyed. She stopped 10 feet from Decker, her eyes moving from him to her daughters and back. The younger girl ran to her, was lifted onto the horse with one strong arm, and buried her face in her mother's shoulder. The woman held her daughter close, her eyes never leaving Decker's face, and in that gaze he saw something that made his breath catch. Not gratitude. Not yet. But recognition. She was measuring him, the same way her older daughter had, deciding what kind of man had touched her children's lives. After a long moment that felt like standing before a judge, she nodded once. Then she spoke, and though Decker didn't understand the words, he understood the tone. The testing had begun. The woman dismounted in one fluid motion, passing the younger daughter to one of the warriors without looking, her eyes still locked on Decker. She moved like water, like wind, like something elemental that couldn't be stopped or predicted. Up close, Decker could see the silver streaks in her black hair, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the old scar that ran along her left forearm. This was a woman who'd survived things, who'd fought, who'd buried people she loved. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that he could smell sage and wood smoke in her clothes, and spoke in Apache. Her voice was low and musical, carrying authority like a river carries weight. One of the warriors translated, his English heavily accented but clear. "She is called Desba. She asks your name." Decker removed his hat, a gesture of respect his father had drilled into him. "Decker Haines, ma'am. I have a ranch east of here." The warrior translated. Desba's eyes narrowed slightly, then she nodded and spoke again. "She says you pulled her daughters from death. She says her oldest daughter told her you were gentle when you could have been rough, patient when you could have been quick, respectful when many white men are not." Desba walked past him to where her older daughter sat. She knelt and examined the splinted leg with hands that knew healing, her fingers gentle but thorough, her face showing nothing. The older daughter spoke rapidly, her words tumbling over each other, and Desba listened without interrupting. When the girl finished, Desba touched her daughter's face with infinite tenderness, then stood and returned to Decker. She spoke again, longer this time, her hands moving in gestures that added layers of meaning Decker couldn't read. The warrior translated. Her daughters were gathering medicine plants in the hills when the ground gave way. They fell. The oldest says you came when you heard their screams, though you didn't know them, though helping them might bring you trouble. You climbed down when the rocks were loose and the fall could have killed you. You gave them food from your own mouth, water from your own supply. You came back when you could have ridden away and forgotten them. She says this makes you a man of honor in a time when honor is rare as rain. Decker felt heat rise in his face, uncomfortable with the praise. Any decent person would have done the same, he said. The warrior translated, and something flickered in Desba's eyes. Amusement, maybe, or recognition of the lie. They both knew most people would have ridden past, would have convinced themselves they'd heard animal sounds, would have decided it wasn't their business. Desba spoke again, and this time her tone changed, became more formal, weighted with significance. She says among her people, a life debt must be answered. You saved 2 lives, and they were not just any lives but the daughters of her blood, the children of a chief's family. This creates obligation, a debt that must be balanced or it will disturb the harmony of the world. She cannot offer you gold because her people don't value yellow metal the way white men do. She cannot give you cattle or horses without creating questions from the Indian agents that would bring soldiers. So she offers you something more valuable than possessions. She offers you a gift that will save your life, though you don't yet know you need saving. Before Decker could respond, Desba moved to her horse and pulled a rolled hide from her saddlebag. She spread it on the ground, revealing a map drawn in plant dyes and charcoal, incredibly detailed, showing terrain Decker recognized and terrain he didn't. She pointed to a spot marked with a red symbol and spoke rapidly. The warrior translated. 3 days from now, men will come to your ranch. 8 of them, led by a man named Cutler who wears a deputy's badge but serves only himself. They're looking for Apache to kill, children to sell across the border into Mexico, women to hurt. They've done this before in the mountains, in the reservation camps. They know the soldiers won't stop them because the soldiers look away. Your ranch is isolated. You are alone. They will come to your door asking about Apache children, and when you tell them you know nothing, they won't believe you. They'll search. They'll burn. They'll leave you in the ashes. The words hit Decker like physical blows. He stared at the map, at the red symbol marking his home, and felt ice form in his gut. How do you know this? He asked. Desba spoke, her face hard now, carved from stone. She says her people watch. They see things white men think are invisible. One of Cutler's men talked too much in a cantina in Santa Rosa, bragging about the money they'll make selling Apache children. Her scouts heard. They tracked the men to their camp north of your valley. They're planning, gathering courage from whiskey, waiting for the right moment. And that moment is 3 days from now, when most of the honest ranchers will be in Santa Rosa for the cattle auction. You'll be alone. That's when they'll come. Decker's mind raced. 8 men, armed and lawless, coming to his home. He was a good shot, but not good enough to take 8 men. His ranch had no defenses, no thick walls, no high ground. If what Desba said was true, and his gut told him it was, he was a dead man unless he ran. But running meant losing everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for. It meant starting over somewhere else, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering when his past would catch up with his present. Desba spoke again, softer now, and the warrior's translation carried an unexpected warmth. She says you gave her daughter's life without asking for anything. Now she gives you the same gift. Her people will help you if you're willing to accept help from those your people call savages. She has a plan, but it requires trust on your part and risk on hers. If you agree, you must come with us now to her camp. If you refuse, you should ride south today and never return to your ranch. But you must decide now, because time is moving and death doesn't wait for men to make up their minds. Decker looked at Desba, at her daughters, at the warriors sitting silent and watchful on their horses. Every instinct he'd developed for survival told him that going to an Apache camp could be the last decision he ever made. But another instinct, deeper and older, told him something different. This woman had come herself, not sent a messenger. She'd brought her warriors into open country where they could be seen, could be reported, could be hunted. She'd shown him her intelligence, revealed her network, trusted him with knowledge that could get her people killed. That wasn't a trap. That was a hand extended across a divide, offered in daylight, without deception. Decker picked up his hat, set it on his head, and looked Desba in the eyes. "I'll come," he said. And something in her face shifted, a tension releasing, a ghost of a smile appearing and vanishing like sun through clouds. She nodded once, sharp and satisfied, and began rolling up the map. The strange reward was beginning to take shape, and it looked nothing like Decker had imagined. It looked like survival. It looked like alliance. It looked like a door opening into a future he'd never considered possible. They rode north into country that got rougher with every mile, the desert giving way to broken mesas and deep canyons where water ran year-round in hidden streams. Decker followed Desba, her gray horse moving with confidence over terrain that would have slowed Rust to a careful walk. The warriors bracketed them, 2 in front and 2 behind, not threatening but alert, their eyes constantly scanning. They moved through draws too narrow for wagons, across rock faces that left no tracks, through juniper groves that closed behind them like doors. This was defensive country, chosen by people who understood that survival meant staying invisible, meant knowing the land so well that it became armor. After 2 hours, they dropped into a canyon where cottonwoods grew thick along a creek, their leaves making music in the wind. And there, tucked against the canyon wall where an overhang created natural shelter, was the camp. It was smaller than Decker expected, maybe 15 families, their wickiups arranged in a loose circle, cook fires burning low to minimize smoke. Children played near the water, their voices bright and careless, and women worked at various tasks, scraping hides, grinding corn, weaving baskets. When Desba rode into camp, activity paused. People turned, saw her daughters, saw Decker, and understanding rippled through the group like wind through grass. A man emerged from the largest wickiup, tall and lean with gray streaking his temples and a face that had seen too many battles. He wore traditional clothing but also a silver belt buckle and cavalry boots, trophies, probably, taken in some long-ago fight. This was the chief, Decker realized, the girl's father, and the man's eyes on him felt like a physical weight. Desba dismounted and went to her husband, speaking rapidly while gesturing toward Decker. The chief listened without expression, then looked at his daughters, taking in the older one's splinted leg, the younger one's protective posture. Something shifted in his face, not warmth, exactly, but acknowledgement. Desba turned to Decker and gestured for him to dismount. He did, acutely aware that he was the only white man in a camp where white men had historically brought only violence and broken promises. A woman came forward and led Rust away, speaking softly to the horse, who followed her with surprising docility. Decker felt naked without his horse, more vulnerable, but he forced himself to stand easy, to show respect through posture and patience. The chief approached, and Decker was struck by how similar his eyes were to his daughter's, that same fierce intelligence, that same capacity for quick judgment. The chief spoke, his voice deep and resonant, and though Decker understood none of it, he caught the tone. This was formal speech, ritual words that meant something beyond their literal meaning. One of the warriors from their group stepped forward to translate. He is called Nanton. He says you are welcome in his camp because you saved his children. He says this is a sacred debt that binds his family to yours. He says you will eat with them, sleep safely among them, and leave when you wish with no harm. He asks you to speak your need. Decker took a breath, organizing his thoughts. Your wife told me about men coming to my ranch. Men who mean to do harm, who are looking for Apache to hurt. She said she has a plan to help me. I came to learn what that plan is, and to thank you for warning me. The warrior translated, and Nanton nodded slowly. He gestured toward his wickiup, an invitation, and Decker followed. Inside, it was dim and cool, the air smelling of sage and leather. They sat cross-legged on woven mats, and Despa joined them, as did two of the warriors. The younger daughter brought water in clay cups, serving Decker first, and he noticed the honor in that gesture. Nanton spoke again, and this time the translation came from Despa herself, her English rough but clear. My husband says the men who come to your ranch are not new evil. They are old evil with new faces. They killed Apache families last winter, took children south to sell as slaves. The army did nothing. The law did nothing. These men think they can do as they wish because we are scattered, because we are weak now, because no one will speak for us. Despa paused, her eyes holding Decker's, weighing him. But you spoke for my daughters when you could have ridden past. You didn't see Apache children. You saw children. This is rare. This is why we help you. Because if men like you die, then only men like Cutler will remain, and our children will have no future at all. Her words settled in Decker's chest, heavy and true. Nanton spoke again, and Despa translated. Here is the plan. In 2 days you return to your ranch. You go about your work as if nothing has changed. When Cutler and his men come, you will be ready, but not alone. My warriors will be hidden, positioned around your ranch. When the moment comes, when Cutler shows his true intention, my people will reveal themselves. We will not kill unless we must, but we will capture these men and take them to the army post at Fort Sumner. There, with you as witness, with evidence we have gathered, with the children they took last winter who still live and can testify, we will demand justice. The army cannot ignore 8 white men caught by Apache and delivered with proof of their crimes. They will have to act, or admit that law means nothing in this territory. Decker considered this, turning it over in his mind like a stone, looking for cracks in the logic. Why not just kill them in the desert? Be simpler. Safer for you. Nanton spoke without the translator, his English broken but passionate. Kill them, make us murderers. White people say Apache are savage, kill for no reason. We show we want law, want justice. Maybe things change small. Maybe next time, someone listen. We are tired of running. Tired of hiding. But peace with honor, not peace with chains. Decker felt something crack open in his chest, a prejudice he hadn't fully acknowledged dissolving under the weight of this man's dignity. Here was a chief who'd lost everything, land, freedom, way of life, but still believed in the possibility of justice, still chose a harder path because it might lead somewhere better. That took courage Decker wasn't sure he possessed. He nodded slowly. I'll do it. I'll trust your plan. The next day, Decker learned things about the Apache that no white man's story had ever told him. He watched Nanton's warriors practice with weapons. Rifles, yes, but also bows that could put an arrow through a man at 40 yards without making a sound. He saw them move through terrain like ghosts, appearing and disappearing, using every rock and shadow. But more than their skill at war, he saw their skill at living. The women showed him plants that could heal wounds, roots that could purify water, flowers that could ease pain. The children taught him a game played with painted stones, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. The older daughter, whose name he learned was Kiona, sat with him by the creek and told him in careful English about her family's history, how they'd once ranged freely across thousands of miles, how the wars had compressed them into smaller and smaller spaces, how her father refused to accept reservation life because it meant abandoning the old ways completely. He says we must remember who we are, she said, her young face serious, or we become ghosts even while living. That evening, Nanton gathered everyone for a council. The entire camp formed a circle around the fire, and Decker sat between Despa and one of the warriors who'd accompanied them. Nanton spoke at length, his voice rising and falling with the rhythms of story, and though Decker understood nothing of the words, he felt their power. People nodded, called out agreement, and when Nanton gestured toward Decker, every face turned. The warrior beside him translated in whispers. The chief tells them what you did for his daughters. He tells them about the men coming to your ranch, about the plan to capture them and seek justice. He asks the warriors to volunteer, knowing this carries great risk. If it goes wrong, if soldiers come hunting them afterward, they could be killed or sent to prison far from their families. He says no one must go unless their heart is willing. One by one, warriors stood, young men and old, some bearing scars from ancient battles, some barely past boyhood. 10 stood in total, more than needed, and Decker felt his throat tighten. These men were willing to risk everything for a white stranger's ranch because that stranger had saved their chief's daughters. After the council, Desba took Decker aside and handed him something wrapped in soft leather. He unwrapped it to find a shirt made of buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that seemed to tell a story. "You cannot wear white man's clothes in the battle," she said. "You must look like one of us, so if someone sees from distance, they count wrong. They think only Apache at your ranch, not you and Apache together. This confuses, makes them hesitate. Hesitation keeps you alive." Decker ran his fingers over the beadwork, marveling at the hours of work it represented, the skill required. "I can't accept this. It's too valuable." Desba's eyes flashed. "My daughters are more valuable than shirt. You accept or you insult my gratitude. Among my people, refusing a gift is same as saying the giver has nothing worth giving." Put like that, Decker had no choice. He accepted the shirt with a bow of his head, and Desba's expression softened. "You are a good man, Decker Haines. Strange that we must meet this way in time of trouble. In better days, maybe we are friends without needing blood and danger to bring us together." That night, Decker slept in a guest wickiup, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar smoke and sage. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the camp settling, quiet conversations, a baby crying and being soothed, someone singing a low, mournful song. He thought about his father, who'd fought Apache during the wars, who'd told stories that painted them as merciless savages. He thought about the reality he'd found here. Families trying to survive, children playing, women working, men protecting. The gap between story and truth was so wide it felt like a canyon, and Decker wondered how many other lies he'd been told, how many other truths he'd never bothered to look for. Sleep finally came, and with it, dreams of fire and smoke and voices crying out, but when he woke in the gray pre-dawn, he felt strangely calm. The fear was still there, coiled in his gut like a snake, but it was manageable now. He had a plan. He had allies. He had a chance. At dawn, the warriors gathered. Nanton gave final instructions, his voice calm and authoritative, and then they prepared their weapons with ritualistic care. Decker watched them paint their faces with patterns that had meanings he didn't understand: protection, courage, victory. One of the younger warriors approached and offered to paint Decker's face, and after a glance at Nanton, who nodded approval, Decker agreed. The paint was cool against his skin, smelling of clay and herbs, and when it was done, the young warrior handed him a small piece of polished metal to use as a mirror. Decker barely recognized himself. The paint transformed his features, made him look fiercer, older, like someone capable of violence when necessary. The warrior smiled. "Now you look like warrior. Maybe you find that part of yourself today." They left the camp as the sun cleared the eastern ridges, 10 warriors and 1 rancher, riding toward a confrontation that would either bring justice or death. The younger daughter ran after them as they left, pressed the wooden horse carving back into Decker's hand. "For luck," she said in English. "Bring back to me after." It was a promise and a prayer, and Decker closed his fingers around it, feeling the weight of what he carried, not just his own life, but the hopes of people who'd been given precious few reasons to hope. They reached Decker's ranch by mid-afternoon, approaching from the north so they could scout without being seen from the main trail. The place looked exactly as he'd left it: small, isolated, vulnerable. The corral fence he'd repaired stood straight and solid, his house squatted low against the sun, and the windmill turned slowly, pulling water from the deep well. It looked like peace, like safety, but Decker knew better now. This was a target, chosen because it was far from help, because a man could be killed here and no one would know for days. Nanton surveyed the terrain with a tactician's eye, pointing out positions and giving instructions in Apache. The warriors spread out, testing sight lines, looking for places to hide that offered both cover and fields of fire. They worked quickly and efficiently, and Decker realized these men had done this before: prepared ambushes, set traps, waited with the patience of hunters for prey that thought itself the hunter. By evening, the positions were set. 2 warriors would be in the barn loft, hidden in the hay with clear views of the yard. 2 more would be in the rocks behind the house, where the ridge offered high ground. 2 would be positioned in the creek bed 50 yards to the east, invisible until they moved. The remaining 4, including Nanton himself, would be inside the house with Decker, ready to emerge when needed. They had rifles, bows, and the element of surprise. But they'd also agreed to Nanton's rule: no killing unless absolutely necessary. The goal was capture and justice, not revenge. That made everything more dangerous, because you couldn't just shoot first and sort it out later. You had to wait, had to be sure, had to give the enemy time to reveal their intentions clearly enough that even a biased army court couldn't ignore the evidence. Decker cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time, his hands needing something to do while his mind churned with worry. What if Cutler didn't come? What if the intelligence was wrong, or the timing off? What if they came with more men than expected, or came at night, or came with army soldiers who'd take Cutler's side regardless of evidence? Nanton sat beside him on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. "You afraid?" he said. It wasn't a question. Decker nodded. "Yes. Aren't you?" Nanton smiled, a brief flash of white teeth in his dark face. "Always afraid before battle. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alive. Man who says no fear is either liar or fool, and both get killed." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "My father taught me, fear is like river. You cannot stop it, cannot make it disappear. But you can choose how you cross. You can be swept away, or you can find the stones, step careful, reach other side. Tomorrow we find stones together." The simplicity of the metaphor settled something in Decker's chest. He wasn't alone in his fear. These warriors felt it too, carried it too, and still chose to act. That was courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it anyway. They spent that night taking turns on watch, 2 men always alert while the others rested. Decker took the midnight to 3 a.m. shift with a warrior named Tarak, who spoke almost no English but communicated through gestures and shared alertness. They sat on the roof, where they could see the approaches in all directions, and the desert night unfolded around them, vast, star-drunk, alive with the whisper of small creatures going about their nocturnal business. Tarak pointed out constellations, tracing patterns in the sky that told Apache stories of creation and transformation, heroes and monsters, love and loss. Decker couldn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. This man was sharing something sacred, offering connection in the darkness, saying without words, "We are not so different, you and I. We both look up and wonder. We both try to find meaning in the chaos." When their watch ended and they climbed down, Decker felt something like brotherhood, fragile and new, but real. Dawn came clear and cold, the sky brightening from black to gray to gold with painful slowness. The warriors took their positions, melting into their hiding spots so completely that even knowing where they were, Decker had trouble spotting them. Nanton and 3 others stayed in the house, crouched below window level, rifles ready but not visible. Decker went about his morning routine, fed Rust, checked the water trough, carried firewood to the house, everything normal, everything calm. But his heart hammered against his ribs and his hands wanted to shake, so he gripped things harder than necessary to keep them steady. The sun climbed higher, heat building, and still nothing happened. Maybe Desba's intelligence was wrong. Maybe Cutler had changed his plans. Maybe the first rider appeared on the southern trail around noon, heat shimmers making him waver like a ghost. Then another and another. 8 in total, just as predicted, riding hard and raising a plume of dust that marked their approach from a mile away. They weren't trying to be subtle. Why would they? They expected 1 man alone, 1 man unprepared, 1 man easy to intimidate or kill. Decker stepped onto his porch, his hand nowhere near his gun, his face carefully neutral. Inside the house, he felt more than heard Nanton and the others going still, breathing shallow, waiting. The trap was set. Now came the hardest part, standing in the jaws and trusting they'd close at the right moment. Cutler dismounted first, his deputy's badge catching the sun like a wink. He was a big man gone soft in the middle, his face flushed red from the ride, his eyes small and calculating under the brim of his hat. The 7 men with him spread out in a loose semicircle, casual but deliberate, cutting off retreat angles without seeming to. Decker recognized the formation. They'd done this before, had it down to muscle memory. "Afternoon," Cutler said, his voice friendly but his eyes hard. "You Decker Haines?" Decker nodded. "I am. What can I do for you?" Cutler smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Just need to ask you a few questions. There's been reports of Apache in the area, renegades, probably hiding out in the canyons. Young ones, maybe. You seen anything like that?" The lie was so smooth it almost sounded reasonable. Decker kept his face blank. "Haven't seen anyone. It's just me out here." Cutler's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "That so? Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough." Before Decker could answer, Cutler gestured to his men. 3 of them started toward the barn, moving with purpose, hands on their gun belts. This was it, the moment of no return. If Decker said yes, they'd search and find the warriors in the barn loft, and it would turn into a bloodbath. If he said no, they'd know he was hiding something and force the issue. Either way, violence was coming. Decker stepped off the porch, putting himself between Cutler and the house. "Actually, I do mind. This is my property, and you've got no warrant, no authority to search it." Cutler's smile vanished. "I'm a deputy. That's all the authority I need out here." Decker shook his head. "Deputy badge doesn't give you the right to trespass. You want to search my place, you get a proper warrant from a judge. Otherwise, you can ride out the way you came in." For a moment, Cutler just stared at him, surprise and anger warring on his face. Then he laughed, a short bark without humor. "Boys," he called to his men, "we got ourselves a lawyer here. Thinks he knows the law." The men laughed too, mean and anticipating, and they started to close in, the pretense of civility dropping away like a shed skin. One of them pulled his rifle from its scabbard. Another loosened his gun in its holster. Cutler took a step toward Decker, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "Last chance, friend. You gonna let us search, or we gonna have to persuade you?" And that's when Nanton stepped through the doorway behind Decker, his rifle leveled at Cutler's chest. "You will do neither," he said in careful English. The effect was electric. Cutler froze, his eyes going wide, his hand stopping halfway to his gun. His men spun, reaching for weapons, and that's when the rest of the trap sprang. Warriors rose from the barn loft, from the rocks, from the creek bed, rifles trained on every one of Cutler's men. 8 white men suddenly facing 10 Apache warriors. Outflanked and outmaneuvered, their advantage evaporated like dew under a brutal sun. For a heartbeat, everything hung in balance. Would Cutler be smart enough to see he was beaten, or stupid enough to go for his gun anyway? Cutler chose stupidity. His hand flashed toward his pistol, and Nanton's rifle cracked, the bullet taking Cutler's hat clean off his head without touching hair. The shot echoed off the canyon walls, and Cutler stumbled backward, his face gone white, his hand freezing in place. "Next one goes through skull," Nanton said calmly. "You decide." Cutler's men had their hands up now, eyes darting between the warriors, calculating and finding no good options. Tarak and another warrior came down from the barn, moving quickly to disarm the men, taking rifles and pistols with efficient roughness. One of Cutler's men, younger than the others, maybe 19, started to shake, his eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want to do this," he babbled. "Cutler said it was legal, said we were protecting settlers I didn't know." "Shut up," Cutler snarled, but the young man kept talking, words tumbling out in a desperate flood. "He's got children locked up, Apache children, in a shed behind his place in Santa Rosa. He's been selling them to a Mexican trader who comes through once a month. I swear I didn't know until yesterday, I swear." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Decker felt rage bubble up in his chest, hot and murderous. Children. Cutler was trading children like livestock. He took a step toward Cutler, his hand moving toward his gun, and Nanton's hand caught his shoulder. "No," the chief said quietly. "This is why we do it this way. So everyone hears. So there is no doubt." He was right, but it took everything Decker had to force his hand away from his weapon. Nanton called out instructions in Apache, and 4 warriors moved to bind the prisoner's hands with rawhide strips. Cutler struggled, tried to kick, and Turok hit him once, hard, in the stomach. Cutler doubled over, wheezing, and when he looked up, there was fear in his eyes for the first time. "You're dead men," he gasped. "All of you. The army will hunt you down. They'll hang you for this." Nanton crouched in front of him, his face inches from Cutler's. "Army will hang you," he said. "We have witnesses. We have children you stole. We have your own man's confession. We deliver you to army. Let them decide who hangs." They rode out an hour later, a strange procession, 10 Apache warriors herding 8 bound white men, with Decker bringing up the rear. They pushed hard, not stopping for rest, eating dried meat and drinking from canteens while in the saddle. The prisoners complained, whined, threatened, but the warriors ignored them, their faces set and grim. They reached Fort Sumner just before sunset on the second day, the adobe walls glowing orange in the dying light. Nanton rode straight to the main gate and demanded to see the commanding officer. The guards stared in shock, Apache warriors riding openly up to a fort, with white prisoners in tow, and one ran to fetch the colonel. Colonel Morrison was a career man with gray mutton-chopped whiskers and eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised, but he looked surprised now. He stood on the parade ground while Nanton explained through a translator, while Decker corroborated every word, while the young prisoner sobbed out his confession again for an audience of soldiers. Morrison's face grew darker with each revelation. He sent men to search Cutler's property in Santa Rosa, and they returned 3 hours later with 5 Apache children, filthy, terrified, but alive. When the children saw Nanton, they ran to him, crying his name, and he held them like a father, his face twisted with grief and rage and relief. Morrison watched his soldiers watch it, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of judgment. "Mr. Cutler, you and your men are under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy to commit slavery, and attempted murder. You'll be tried by military tribunal since these crimes occurred in federal territory. Given the evidence and witnesses, I suspect you'll hang." He turned to Nanton. "Chief, I'm grateful you brought these men to justice instead of taking it into your own hands. That took restraint I'm not sure I'd possess. Your people are free to go, with my word that no action will be taken against you for today's events." Nanton nodded once, sharp and satisfied. He looked at Decker, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, the acknowledgement of a battle fought together and won. Then the warriors mounted and rode out, the rescued children with them, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Decker watched them go and felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening onto a landscape he'd never known existed. 3 weeks later, Decker was working on his corral when he saw riders approaching from the north. His hand moved toward his rifle, instinct still sharp from the confrontation with Cutler, but then he recognized Desba's gray horse and felt tension drain away. She rode with Nanton and their 2 daughters, the older one sitting a horse now with her leg healed, the younger one riding behind her mother. They came into his yard and dismounted, and Decker walked out to meet them, suddenly aware of how rough he looked, unshaved, dusty, his shirt torn from working with wire fencing. "Welcome," he said, and meant it down to his bones. Nanton clasped his forearm in the warrior's grip, and Desba smiled, a real smile, warm and open. The girls ran to him, the younger one throwing her arms around his waist, and Decker felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. They sat on his porch in the shade, and Desba handed him a bundle wrapped in soft leather. "The reward," she said. "Open it." Decker unwrapped it carefully, revealing 3 items. First, a knife in a beaded sheath, the blade perfectly balanced, the handle wrapped in leather worn smooth by many hands. "This was my grandfather's," Desba said. "He carried it in the wars against Mexico, against the Spanish before them. It has protected 3 generations. Now it protects you." Second, a small leather pouch containing seeds. "These are medicine plants," Nanton explained. "You plant near your spring. They grow, you learn to use them. When we pass through, we will pass through sometimes, we harvest together. This makes your land sacred ground, protected by old agreements. No Apache will ever harm you or yours." Third, and most surprising, a paper, official-looking with a territorial seal. Decker unfolded it and read slowly, his eyes widening. It was a letter from Colonel Morrison stating that Decker Haines had acted with honor and courage in bringing criminals to justice and recommending him for any federal contracts or employment he might seek in the territory. Attached was a voucher for $500, payment for services rendered to the United States Army in the apprehension of felons. The colonel asked us what reward you deserved, Desba said. We told him your ranch needed improvements, your herd needed growing. This money helps. But the real reward is what it represents. White man's paper saying you are honorable, you are trusted. This protects you in your world, like medicine plants protect you in ours. Decker stared at the paper, at the money voucher, understanding the profound gift he'd been given. In a territory where reputation meant everything, where a man's word was his only currency, this letter was worth more than gold. It would open doors, create opportunities, establish him as someone important men vouched for. Combined with the knife and the seeds, he'd been given protection in both worlds, the world of law and paper, and the older world of sacred ground and honored promises. I don't know what to say, he managed. Nanton gripped his shoulder. Say nothing. Live honorably. Teach your children, when you have them, that Apache are not savages. Tell true stories. That is enough. They stayed for dinner, and Decker cooked the best meal he could manage, beans and cornbread and coffee, simple but shared with warmth. The younger daughter sat beside him and returned the wooden horse carving. You brought it back, she said solemnly. Now luck stays with you always. They talked as the sun set, about small things and large, weather and horses, the children rescued from Cutler, now returned to their families, the changes coming to the territory as more settlers arrived. Nanton spoke of his fear that his people's ways would be forgotten, that his grandchildren would grow up not knowing the old songs, the old stories. Decker found himself promising to help however he could, to stand witness, to tell truth when others told lies. It felt like a vow, and in a way it was. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, Desba stood. We should go. Long ride to camp. But before they mounted, she took Decker's hands in hers. You asked why I called the reward strange, she said. I will tell you. The reward is not knife or seeds or paper. These are just symbols. The real reward is this. You are no longer alone. You have family now, across the divide. You have people who will come if you need them, who will remember you in prayers, who will teach their children your name as example of what white man can be. This is strange reward because it cannot be held or spent or shown. But it is most valuable thing we can give. Decker watched them ride away into the darkness, their silhouettes merging with the night until he couldn't distinguish horse from rider from shadow. He stood in his yard until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, until there was only the wind and the crickets and the endless stars. Then he went inside and placed the knife above his mantle, the seeds in a jar on his table, the letter in his strongbox. He lay in bed and thought about his father, about all the stories he'd been told growing up, about how easy it was to believe lies when they confirmed what you wanted to think. He'd learned different. He'd been given a strange reward, not wealth or power, but connection. Family. A place in two worlds instead of one. In the morning he'd plant those seeds. He'd start building the additions to his ranch that the money would buy. He'd live in a way that honored the trust placed in him. But tonight, he just lay in the darkness and felt grateful, for the girls who'd fallen into a ravine, for his choice to climb down after them, for everything that had flowed from that single moment of deciding to be the kind of man who helped instead of rode past. The strange reward was proving to be the most valuable thing he'd ever received. It was proving to be a chance at a better life, earned through courage and sealed with trust across a divide that most people never crossed. And somehow, in the vast and violent West, that felt like the beginning of something important. Something that might, if enough people made the same choice, eventually look like peace.